It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can just reach me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Today, I'm very excited about our guest today. Now, the book is called Hitman, Power Brokers and Fast Money Inside the Music Business, and we have an expert, Fredric Dannen. You can find him, too. He's got a podcast. Believe it or not, he's got a podcast. Who has a podcast these days? But Fredric Dannen does. Right? It's called smapodcast.com. His next live production is coming out in August, and it's related to a theater company that he has down there in Mexico called La Trupa de Mexico. Mr. Fredric Dannen, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, you sound great. Okay, tell us about yourself. Who is Fredric Dannen?
Well, dear, I was born in New York City. I was an English major. As the first editor who hired me said, God must have loved English majors, made so many of them. But I never studied journalism. I learned on the job. I worked at McGraw-Hill as a book editor. That's where English majors go to die, I guess. And I managed to get into the training program for their magazine division, which at the time published Business Week and other trade publications. And I ended up on the staff of Chemical Week, which was like Business Week, but just for the chemical industry. You know, Dow, Union Carbide, Monsanto. And I did not have a business or journalism degree, but I was interviewing heads of Fortune 100 companies and writing cover stories on them. It was the best training a prospective journalist could receive. Within 10 years of that job, I was a staff writer for The New Yorker. It's a very unusual career path. In between, I left my magazine writing job to write Hitman, to report and write the book. It was based on that I was hired at Vanity Fair by Tina Brown, and then she took me with her to The New Yorker. I ended up going to Texas to work on a book on capital punishment. I got a gentleman out of prison with DNA testing. I got him a full pardon from Governor Rick Perry plus restitution. And then things got a little bit out of hand, and I moved to Mexico, which is where I live.
Okay, wait a minute. Don't brush past that. Things got out of hand? What are you talking about, man? What happened?
What happened is I got this innocent man out of prison, Calvin Washington, and I did it with DNA, and in good old-fashioned investigating, something you know well. And there was another innocent inmate in prison, and now Calvin had been framed by corrupt law enforcement. This is a matter of record. I'm not libeling anybody or slandering anyone. And I was hit with a subpoena. Some judge in Waco, Texas, wanted to compel me to testify. And I knew that the purpose of the subpoena was to get me to reveal where we had the biological evidence for this other case of this other inmate who'd been framed and was serving a life sentence. I knew that if the subpoena was served on me, that I was not going to give a deposition, because I didn't want to be asked under oath where the evidence was, because it was the purpose of the opposing party to find that evidence and destroy it. I know this sounds like a David Lynch movie. It kind of felt like it. So I came down to Mexico. I was living in Texas at the time. It's where I was doing my research. I came down to San Miguel de Allende because a friend of mine was coming here. I thought I'd just stay here long enough to get the subpoena quashed. That was almost 20 years ago. I never left. This became my home.
Yeah, people don't understand the ramifications that comes with this kind of work. It's not all fun and games. And even, all these youngsters out there with these podcasts, it's not all fun and games, man.
It is not.
Yeah. Now, Hitmen, power brokers, and fast money inside the music business. You kind of, what was your background in the music industry before you decided to write this book?
Well, here's what happened. I mentioned I was at Chemical Week. My editor there was a woman named Claudia Deutsch, who I adored. She was a terrific editor. She became an editor at the New York Times business page, and she asked me if I would do a story for her, freelance. And I said, yes, but it's not going to be about the chemical industry. I already write about that. She said, well, what would you like to write about? And I said, well, I'm a musician by training. I'm classically trained. I had the same piano teacher as Billy Joel, in fact. And I said I'd like to do something on the music business. So that ended up being a business page cover story on Polygram Records. And that's what led to my quitting my job and signing a book contract with Random House.
Oh, okay. And so did you have knowledge of corruption in the music industry before you started the book?
Actually, no. I was a business journalist. I had never written about organized crime. My introduction to organized crime was working on hitmen, and that became my principal beat at Vanity Fair, and particularly at The New Yorker, where I was the Annals of Crime editor. I wrote mainly about the mafia, the Hong Kong triads, and so forth. I had never written about capital punishment. I didn't know anything about capital litigation until one day I got a call about a supposedly innocent man on death row in Texas, and they executed him, and I went down to Waco to start looking into the case, and that's how I got involved in that subject. So it was a career path from business writing to crime writing, which some people would tell you is a natural segue.
Yeah, we got to have you come back and tell us that whole story about the prisoner. And no, I'm serious. That's sure. Right up our alley, too.
Right.
But now, we're all familiar with payola, the drugs in the music industry. You even hear stories about people like Jimi Hendrix were murdered, in order to steal their what a catalog it's called, right? And about people like Meyer Lansky's family were financing Michael Jackson's catalog again, too. And, these rappers that are involved in cocaine smuggling. We just did a whole show about these rappers down in Miami. They're producing porn and they're flying around in private jets back and forth to the Caribbean. I'm not going to accuse them of anything, but God knows what they're doing. What are we going to find in hitmen, power brokers, and fast money inside a music business?
Well, this is the funny thing, Ed. I have a really good friend, Fred Goodman, who was an editor and a writer at Rolling Stone. And he wrote a book called The Mansion on the Hill, which is a terrific book, by the way. I highly recommend it. But Fred's thesis was exactly the opposite of mine. It's not that he was wrong or I was right and he was wrong. We were looking at different aspects of the business. His thesis was that the rock and roll business started out idealistic because it came out of the folk scene and it got corrupted by the money. My thesis is that the business never changed at all. It started out corrupt and it just got bigger and more corrupt. And we're both right, but we were looking at different subsets. What happened is that the original rock and roll labels were independent labels because the major labels were resistant. We all know the stories about how difficult it was for the Beatles to get signed. So the great early rock and roll recordings were on little labels like Chess and Roulette. Roulette, for example, was owned by Morris Levy, who was tied in with the Genovese crime family. So what happened is that rock and roll came out of labels like that had sort of Runyon-esque people running them, some of them with actual mafia ties in the case of Morris Levy. And when the bigger corporations like Sony, Warner, rather CBS or Columbia, Warner, and MCA got involved in this, the culture came with it. And what happened, what the story of Hitmen is about, what I called institutionalized payola, because what was happening in the 50s, in the days of Alan Freed, was really small-time stuff. It was disc jockeys being bribed with cash generally to play certain records, the so-called $50 handshake. By the 80s, it had changed to the point where you had this group called the Network some of whom were tied in with organized crime, who were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to radio station program directors on behalf of these big multinational corporations, but they were doing it at arm's length so that they would have plausible denial. So, as I said, the culture didn't change, it just got bigger.
So then, besides the payola to get records played, and I guess a lot of these guys, they came out of the nightclub business too, right?
Many of them did.
Right.
That's right. Morris Levy's a perfect example of that. He owned Birdland.
Yeah, see, that makes sense then, because all those guys, they're all up to something, as you like to say. So then, besides the payola, then what other kind of corruption is there? Leg breaking, murders? What else goes on?
Yes, there was actual leg breaking. It was a turf dispute between the Scotti brothers, which was an independent company in California, and some people from Cleveland. That is detailed in the book Hitmen. But the other area of mafia involvement was in booking, particularly of black artists. There was an organization known as Queen's Booking, and members of the I think the DeCavalcanti crime family. I'm testing my memory here because it's been a while, but among the artists who were victimized, quite famously, Sammy Davis Jr. He had to testify before Congress about this, and it fascinates me because to this day, people talk about Frank Sinatra as the guy with the mafia ties because there's a famous picture of him with Paul Castellano and so forth. I think Sinatra's involvement with the mafia is somewhat exaggerated. Sammy Davis's, on the other hand, was real. I mean, he owned a racehorse with Gaetano Vastola. All of this was coerced. It's not that he wanted to be in business with them. It's just that they typically looked at black artists as easier marks, people that they could victimize. It's a very shameful history.
That's interesting. You mentioned the Cavalcanti family, which is the series The Sopranos is based on that, and
right
on that particular family. And specifically, there was a character on there too who was in the music business, an old Jewish guy. I forget his name, but you know what I'm saying. They even did an episode.
I
too.
know exactly who you mean. He was patterned on Morris Levy. But he was nothing like Morris Levy, that character. And then in the TV show Vinyl, there was also a Morris Levy character, also, in my opinion, not very well drawn. The real Morris Levy, if he had been on The Sopranos, he was such a force of nature, he would have buried everybody. He would have blown everyone else off the screen, including Tony Soprano. But not to take anything away from the Sopranos, a terrific show. But the Morris Levy depicted in that show was rather rabbinic, Talmudic wisdom. The real Morris Levy was one of the most dynamic characters I've ever met. In fact, of all the people that I wrote about in Hitmen, he's the one that has stayed in my memory the longest.
Yeah, on the series,
most vividly, yes.
It was Hesh. Hesh was on The Sopranos. Right? My memory's not shot yet. Okay. Now, what about any famous murders that we would know about that went on?
Murders?
Yeah.
I'd have to think about that for a minute. Because there were a lot of rumors of people who were supposedly bumped off. I don't know that any of those stories held water in the end. Do you have one in mind in particular? Refresh my memory.
No, I absolutely don't have one in mind. Now, because I was just figuring, because the book is called Hitman, that there would be some.
Well, the thing is, it's a play on words, right. Of course. Hitman, that is the men, and they were always men in that era. I don't remember the woman's name now, but there was a book published a few years ago, terrific book by a woman who had worked for Ahmet Ertegun at Atlantic and had dealings with other major industry figures. And it was about the rampant sexism and sexual harassment in the business. And it's during the commercial break, I'll look this up because it's a book I highly recommend. But they were typically men who made hit records, but also the book is about mafia figures. So hence the title, Hitmen, play on words.
Gotcha. Hey, what about like Alan Klein, who was managing the Beatles there for a while? What can you tell us about him?
Well, I mean, a lot has been written about Alan Klein. I didn't go into him in very much detail in Hitmen. He's not a particularly beloved figure by Beatles fans. I think after Brian Epstein died, there was a lot of chaos in terms of management of the Beatles. I think all this is pretty well documented. I don't think I have anything particularly novel to say about Alan Klein.
So, but in a situation like that, where you have a guy like Alan Klein, who's notorious in his background, and he's managing the Beatles. Now, is this a situation where they're bringing him in saying, okay, this is our guy, this is our muscle, or is it the other way around where they're saying, okay, you guys work for me?
I don't know that Alan Klein was a muscle guy. An interesting case, though, is Bob Marley. His manager was a guy named Danny Sims. Now, this is very well documented in my book. I don't know if Danny is still living. But this all came out in civil court. In fact, in front of Judge Elliot Wilk, who became famous in the Woody Allen case. And I sat through that trial. But Danny Sims absolutely had ties to the Gambino crime family. That's a matter of record. I picked up on FBI wiretaps. And again, I quote this in my book. And Sims was managing Marley, and there was a lawsuit over the copyright of No Woman, No Cry, which was extremely valuable. And the argument for the lawyers for Danny Sims was that he didn't get the money that was due to him because he was intimidated by these tough Rasta guys down in Jamaica. And during a break in the proceedings, I spoke to the counsel for the Marley estate because Hitmen hadn't been published yet. I was still reporting it. And I said, are you aware of Danny Sims' background? I said, he's tied in with the Gambino crime family. He's not going to be intimidated by some Rasta guy in Jamaica. And they toyed for a while with bringing that out, but they ended up having other really good evidence, and they won that case against Sims. Sims lost, and the Marley estate won, which was the proper disposition of justice in that case. But again, I get back to what I was saying. You're going to find that exploitation occurred across the board, black and white, but it was particularly rampant with black artists.
And I guess because historically they come in more poor, than white artists would come in.
Well, they also, I think that, the mafia attitude toward people of color. Yeah. They don't regard them as people. And it's they. One thing I really love about the movie Goodfellas, as someone who's covered organized crime, is that it is the truest depiction I've ever seen of what the mafia really is. It's not The Godfather, as much as I love those first two movies. They're stupid, they're depraved, there's no honor, and they'll kill each other for a nickel. I mean, these are not. I mean, the way that John Gotti rose to the head of the Gambino family, as you know, was he bumped off the guy who was ahead of him. I mean, these are not criminal masterminds.
Yeah, it's so true, especially in Goodfellas, hung over, showing up with the guns, with the silencers, they don't fit, that kind of stuff too as well.
Right.
But speaking of, now what about a figure like Al Sharpton? You hear about Al Sharpton in his FBI files?
Yes, and I have to say, I want to be careful how I phrase this, but I did interview Al Sharpton for Vanity Fair. This is a matter of record. And the first thing Sharpton said was that he'd read Hitmen, he'd given it as a Christmas gift. I think Sharpton is a very bright, very witty guy, somebody that I guess I'd love to have a beer with sometimes. But what I wrote about in Vanity Fair was his involvement with the Michael Jackson tour. Right. I did a piece on Michael Franzese, who was a capo in the Colombo crime family. And at this point, Michael is living in Los Angeles. He's left the mafia. He's in the movie business. And he was very frank. I mean, I asked him about a whole number of people. I recorded those interviews, and I asked him, for example, about Mario Cuomo, because there have been these rumors about Cuomo. He said, absolute nonsense. He said, people get picked up on wiretaps bragging, I know this guy, I know that guy. He said, Cuomo was never involved with us. But I mentioned Sharpton, and I got a really powerful reaction from him. He said that Sharpton had come to Michael with a scheme to shake down the Michael Jackson tour that Norby Walters, who was a white booking agent, was in charge of. All of this is documented in my Vanity Fair article. It's public record. I don't think any of this gets mentioned when people talk about Al Sharpton. He's got a rather complex background. I also think, frankly, that the whole Tawana Brawley episode, he's gotten a free pass on that, and I don't understand that to this day. I don't approve of his conduct in that case. Having said that, I think he's a brilliant, witty guy. I think his insights. I like his political commentary very much. I enjoy watching him on MSNBC on the rare occasions that I watch cable news. So I think highly of him in all of those respects. But I did interview him, and the results of that interview are, as I say, a matter of record.
I'm curious now. What is the date of that Vanity Fair article?
That would have been the early 90s. The story's called The Born Again Don. It was a profile of Michael Franzese. I asked Sharpton to comment on Michael Franzese's statement about his involvement with the Jackson tour. And
because they co-produced that tour.
Again, I don't want to rely on my memory here, Ed. Yeah. I would go back and re-reference the article. But as I said, I did interview him. He disputed Michael Franzese's account, and people will have to decide. Franzese is certainly not a reputable guy, so you got to take all of that into consideration. I think the Village Voice did a cover story on Sharpton as an FBI informant. You know about this, right?
Oh yeah. I've known Al Sharpton, not recently, but when I was a kid back in the Lower East Side, New York City, I was an activist myself, and so we knew Al Sharpton back in those days. And like you said, personable guy, man. This is a guy you can sit there and listen to him talk.
I agree, and I really enjoyed the interview with him. I think I would not want to be in a battle of wits with Al Sharpton. He's a very, very bright man. Yeah,
extremely charming, engaging. And I think I'm on those wiretaps, okay? Because he used to walk around with a briefcase where he was taping people for the FBI. And part of his work for the FBI, too, if you read the smoking gun documents, which were FBI documents, was he was collecting money involved in music industry debts. Well, that was part of his deal there with that.
Well, you know more about that than I do then. All I know was about the subject that I discussed with Franzese. And I have to say, I found Franzese credible in that, if I mentioned a name and he knew something, like Jerry Gutterman, for example, he would only go so far as what he knew. Again, this as an investigator. I know this as a journalist. You're always evaluating the quality of information, but there are certain tells when you're interviewing somebody, whether they're shining you on or whether they're giving it to you straight from the shoulder. I think what Franzese told me was reliable.
And I'm fascinated, but you're not sure if your article came out before or after they worked together on that tour?
No, it was after.
It was after.
He was talking about that. The article would have been, let's see, I left Vanity Fair for the New Yorker in 92, I think, the end of 92. So that article was probably 91. It's called The Born Again Don. It's in Vanity Fair. It should be pretty easy to find.
You know what? I think I've read that article without even realizing it. Because that's a very familiar title to me. And I've looked up Franzese. My sister actually went to his wedding. Okay, that's because we're from Staten Island originally. Okay, so, we're all mixed up and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, let's take a look.
Actually, I'd like to, I don't know if this is too wide of the mark.
Go ahead.
I'd like to tell you a story about Michael. I grew up on Long Island. My hero, Bob Greene, at Newsday had written that famous article, The Hood in Our Neighborhood, about Sonny Franzese. And Michael's stepfather or possibly biological father. And I went to interview Tina, Michael's mother, and his stepsister, and at the moment I can't remember her name. She was sitting in the early part of the interview, and she had just taken a shower. She was very scantily dressed, and I thought basically she was screwing with me, and I didn't want to go in that direction, knowing how dangerous that could be. The mother told her, please leave the room, which she did. But before she did, she mentioned to me that she was all excited because she was about to go down to Miami. And she did. And that very weekend, she went down to Miami and OD'd and died. Oh. And I knew about this before Michael did. I was actually the one who broke him the news. These are some of the strange things that happen to you as a journalist. It's certainly one of the more horrifying chapters of my career as a journalist.
Yeah, that's tragic. That's just tragic. And it's so true. People don't realize, you're writing an article or you do a radio interview or any kind of it. You get involved in each other's lives, You get to know these people.
It's funny, too. When I've given my seminar on interviewing, I always encourage the students to watch the movie Almost Famous, which is one of my favorite films. I think it's one of the great journalism films ever made. And the reason I say that, you know the movie?
Rolling Stone.
Film?
Rolling Stone? It's like the Rolling Stone
right.
kid? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a semi-autobiographical movie that Cameron Crowe wrote and directed, where he's a 15-year-old kid named William Miller, and he's riding around with this rock band called Stillwater, and they're on the cutting edge of fame. And what that movie demonstrates so brilliantly is the treacherous relationship of journalist and subject and the inherent betrayal that goes in both directions. I encourage anybody who's interested in a career in journalism to watch that film.
Yeah, there's like a little part in there, too, based on I think the groupies, and that woman who does she used to make those plaster.
Penny Lane?
No, Penny Lane is one, right? But the other one was the one who would make the plaster of Parises.
Right.
Oh, yeah. And she just passed away. She just passed away like a month ago.
Oh, did she?
Yeah,
I didn't know.
I know.
Well, Oliver Sholem.
Yeah, and these iconic historic figures, and just vanish right before our faces. Okay, we've been talking to Fredric Dannen. The book is called Hitmen, Power Brokers and Fast Money Inside the Music Business. His podcast, you can check him out. Very fascinating guy. Is smapodcast.com. And the next live production coming out of this is going to be in August. And real quick, describe to us, what is this theater company you're working on with down there in Mexico?
My girlfriend partner, Marcela Brondo, she comes from an acting family, a family of very famous actors in Mexico. Her uncle, Hector Bonilla, would be like the equivalent of a Jack Nicholson. Roberto Sosa, her cousin, Evangelina Martinez. She's as talented as all of them, and she's also a wonderful director. She and I created a bilingual theater company. We live in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. And this is a town with a tremendous number of U.S. American expatriates. So it's a bilingual city. Some days you can walk around and hear more English spoken than Spanish here. And so we created this company called La Troupe, or La Troupe Mexico, because there's more than one La Troupe. And we present plays generally in Spanish with English supertitles, although we've gone in the other direction. And our podcast consists of radio theater and short fiction performed by actors, half in English and half in Spanish. So it's a truly bilingual podcast.
Excellent. And one more time, that's smapodcast.com, and the next live production is coming out in August. Now,
right. We're doing the play El Codex Romanov by Estelle Laniero at the San Miguel Playhouse in August. We will record the 5 performances before live audiences and then edit it for podcast. So it won't be heard live on SMA Podcast. It'll be heard edited, and probably not until September or October because it takes some time to do the editing.
Gotcha.
But there's a lot of content on there now, including some terrific radio plays and our Parnassus project, or Proyecto Parnassus, which we created during the COVID lockdown, where we had actors reading great works of short fiction. Highly recommended. You'll find it also on Spotify if you search Parnassus Project.
We're talking today to Fredric Dannen. Wealth of information about this, the music industry, a lot of stuff, man. He saved a guy who was on death row prison in Texas. Hitmen, power brokers, and fast money inside the music business. Keep an eye out for his podcast, smapodcast.com. It's about his theater company down there in Mexico. I don't know why. I got to ask this now. Did you meet your fiance or your girlfriend you keep talking about? Did you meet her in Mexico, or did she escape the U.S. with you to go down to Mexico?
No. I met her here in San Miguel. We've been together 6 years. We met through a mutual friend. And I didn't realize when we started dating about her theater background. Theater is my great passion, apart from music. We realized very quickly that there was a kind of cultural apartheid here in San Miguel, that there was an English-speaking theater community and a Spanish-speaking one with different actors, different audiences. And we thought, let's bring everybody together. And that's what we've done with La Troupe.
Fascinating. You can check that out at smapodcast.com. Now back to the book, Hitman, Power Brokers and Fast Money Inside the Music Business. What about Phil Spector?
Phil Spector.
Oh, no.
The best thing I ever read on Phil Spector, of course, is Tom Wolfe's The First Tycoon of Teen. Have you ever read that? It was a magazine article that Wolfe did on Spector, at an early stage in his career, when he was just, I think, breaking out with the Ronettes and all of that. It's a fascinating profile. But, they say character is destiny. You just reread that profile, and everything that developed with Phil Spector, you almost could have predicted.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated with Spector. I saw a documentary on him years and years and years ago, so then I probably did read that article. I've read everything I could. But now, what about his connections, like organized crime and stuff?
I'm not aware of his connections to organized crime. I'm not saying there weren't any. It's not something that came up in my reporting. It's a funny thing. Again, if you'll just permit me a very quick segue, because I think people always need to be careful when they talk about mob ties or mafia ties. It has a specific meaning. It doesn't mean you bumped into a gangster at Elaine's. That's not having mob ties. I actually got into a big fight with the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper about 20 years ago over the Hong Kong actor Chow Yun-fat, who was in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, acted opposite Jodie Foster and Anna and the King. Terrific actor, terrific human being. I did a book on Hong Kong cinema, and before that, an article, big feature for the New Yorker on Hong Kong cinema. And the Chronicle did a story saying that Chow Yun-fat had mafia ties. Well, it was an absurd thing to say. You couldn't make movies in Hong Kong without being in business with the triads. He made business for a company that was owned by the Heung family, and they were very well-known Sun Young triad family. I mean, this is all, again, a matter of record. And I wrote a letter of protest, and I said, don't say that the man had mob ties because he made movies for this movie company. He had no choice. So again, I'm always careful in telling you who was Morris Levy, no question about it. That was a connected guy. But as far as Spector, I can't speak to that. You probably know more than I do.
Now, you said the book you wrote about it's called Hong Kong Babylon?
Yes, well, I co-wrote the book with Barry Long,
Gotcha.
Since deceased, I'm sorry to say. And it was published by Faber and Faber in London. Then it was republished by Harvey Weinstein at Miramax Books, and I had quite a fascinating meeting with him. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, how'd that turn out for you? Was it in a hotel room? Probably not, right?
No, it was in his office, and he took the occasion to call someone into his office and bully them right in front of me. It was it was not one of the more enjoyable afternoons that I have spent.
Yeah, so you hear those stories. It's so typical, What about you hear these names like David Geffen and Tommy Mottola, private planes, kind of stuff for shenanigans.
David Geffen, let me say this about Geffen. Before Hitmen was published, somebody got their hands on the manuscript. It leaked out of Random House. I have a pretty good theory as to how that happened. I'm going to keep that to myself. But to my horror, some of the key characters in the book, notably Clive Davis and David Geffen and Alan Grubman, the attorney, had copies. Clive threatened to sue me. He sicked Robert Morvillo on me, held the book up for 2 months, which I think helped lead the book to become a bestseller. I ended up changing absolutely nothing about Clive, except I think his age. I think I misstated in one paragraph, that he was 24 when he was actually 23 at a certain moment in his life, or the other way around. That's the extent to which I libeled him. The funniest thing with Clive was that Leslie Olsner, who was the lawyer for Random House, was going over the book with me, and complaint by complaint, she said, well, he says that this account of his first meeting with Bob Dylan, she said, is false and defamatory. She said, what's your source? I said, my source is Clive's autobiography. And I showed it to her, and at that point she realized this guy's out of his mind. So that lawsuit went nowhere. Alan Grubman, to his credit, called me up, invited me into his office, served me chicken soup with kreplach, and negotiated with me, because everything with Alan's a negotiation. He doesn't threaten, he cajoles. And as a result of that, I actually did make one voluntary change in the manuscript that I didn't have to do, but it's because he asked me like a gentleman. David Geffen, who is no gentleman, sicked Burt Fields on me. And what was particularly ridiculous about all that was he could have just called me like Alan did. And the matter would have been resolved in 2 minutes, because the thing he was complaining about in my manuscript had already been removed in the course of fact-checking. It wasn't even in the book. He didn't bother to call and ask. He just sicked his bulldog on me. That's an indication in the kind of person that David Geffen is. He's not somebody that I have any admiration for.
It is so true. If there's an error in reporting, it's not that big a deal to correct it. We want to correct what's wrong.
It wasn't actually an error. Yeah. It had to do with Geffen at that time had not outed himself, and an activist wanted to do that, and he gave me a piece of information that turned out to be false, and it was in the manuscript flagged as as one of the things I needed to check out. I mean, remember, this is an unedited manuscript. You put a lot of things in that you're going to take out later because they don't check out. You know this.
Yeah, well, also, too, by the way, that they got without your permission. Am I correct?
Well, the thing is that the lawyer said this event you're describing never took place, and we have a cause of action here. We hadn't even published the book yet. And again, all I said, we wrote back, and I just said, sorry to burst your bubble here, but this isn't even in the book anymore. The book hasn't been published yet, and there's no need for you to, rattle your sabers here. It's just an indication of a type of personality that I'm not going to. I'll give you another example. Somebody who rose in my esteem after I published Hitmen, and that's Frank DeLeo, since deceased. Also, I'm sorry to say, you'll see Frank as Tootie Cicero in Goodfellas. Did a terrific acting job for a non-actor. Actually, a better actor than Michael Jackson turned out to be. But Frank was Michael Jackson's manager, and he'd been a bookie. I'd written about how he'd been a bookie before he was working for Columbia Records, and then later became Jackson's manager. This was all documented in Hitmen. I had the police record and all that where he got caught. And I was giving a tour for the book, and in a couple of radio interviews, I mentioned this I thought very funny story about DeLeo. And he called me on the phone one day, and he said, I don't need for my kids to be hearing this. And I said, Frank, I'm never going to bring it up again. I appreciate the phone call. That's how I roll. I mean, I'm not in the business of inflicting pain. Sometimes you don't have really much choice. You're a journalist. You have different constituencies, but you have a covenant with your readers, which is not to put in anything that you know not to be true, and not to omit something that's highly material, even though it can have some negative consequences. Everything's a judgment call. I wouldn't have removed that from the book, but I certainly was willing to take it out of my radio promotional interviews because he asked me, and he asked me nicely. Something like that would never occur to Irving Azoff or David Geffen, who are two peas in a pod as far as I'm concerned.
Now, real quick, did you teach that in your interviewing class when you were teaching these kids on how to do interviews?
I did actually bring up these examples. I said that the thing is that there's some people that you'll interview that have no experience being interviewed, and they're very easy to take advantage of. Mm-hmm. And then there are people who are very sophisticated about this who are trying to manipulate you. And I said, your decision on what's fair game and what isn't. A lot of journalists, too many of them think they're the reincarnation of John Peter Zenger, and they puff themselves up like they're they're some kind of moral police force. And they say, well, they didn't say off the record, so it's fair game. I don't do that. I will protect someone from themselves if they, it's sort of like if you're in a negotiation with someone, you're so much a better business person than they are. It's very easy for you to get the better of them in a deal. It comes down to your sense of ethics. Ed, it really does. And I can give you specific examples where there are things that I could have used that were fair game that I just didn't, just because I didn't feel good about it.
Now, we are running out of time. Clive Davis, what did you have to say about Clive Davis?
Well, the funny thing with Clive is that if he had just rested on the things he was great at, and that was a lot of things, one wouldn't have many complaints about him, but this is a guy who's constantly rewriting history. That documentary on him, where they talk about his involvement in the payola scandal, it's sheer nonsense. I went to Bayonne, New Jersey, to the Federal Records Center, and I got his allocution in the tax case where he was sentenced by Judge Grisey, and I know exactly what happened. And it's not the way he depicts history. He's someone with an enormous ego. His own secretary said he thought they named the CD after him. Yeah. He's somebody who always took credit for every signing that turned out really well. And so what did I do? I wrote the truth about him, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, one of the things that developed from that is that I got a call one day from Tony Bennett saying he wanted to have lunch. This was a great honor for me. But you know what they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Tony Bennett had never forgiven Clive for really pushing him off Columbia Records. It was Mottola who brought him back. Tony really liked the way that I depicted Clive in the book, which is both positive and negative. But Clive, as I say, threatened he did threaten a lawsuit. He was unsuccessful. He did not get me to change anything material in the book because I had not libeled him.
And Tommy Mottola?
Well, Tommy. What can I say? I mean, that Walter Yetnikov hasn't himself said about Tommy Mottola. I do think that Tommy ended up doing a better job at Sony than people expected. And I would include myself in that. But anyway.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Why don't you tell us the story about Walter Yetnikov?
Well, Walter is one of the main characters of my book, and he hated the book. He hated me. And he said some very unkind things about me in various interviews, some of which were not true, but nevertheless. I ended up actually becoming much fonder of Walter after he got clean and sober. He did a lot of charity work. He he also testified in the trial for really who I considered my best friend in the music industry, Steve Popovich Sr., who also has passed away, I'm sorry to say. But Steve was the guy who had the Cleveland International label, and he was the one who put out Bat Out of Hell, Meatloaf, after everyone, including notably Clive Davis, turned it down. And Sony screwed him out of his royalties and out of having his Cleveland International logo on the albums, and he sued. And Yednikov came to his aid as a witness. And I thought Yednikov's testimony was absolutely brilliant. And in the expanded version of Hitman, for the ebook edition, I added an extra chapter for the 20th anniversary edition, and I went into that whole story about Walter's testimony on behalf of Steve Popovich. And it's very funny reading. I mean, he was a brilliant witness, absolutely outfoxed the lawyer for Sony. I recommend that people read that. That chapter was excerpted in Billboard. By the way, I now write for Billboard. I write mainly about classical music for Billboard. I have terrific relationships there, terrific editors there. For Billboard, when Walter died recently, I wrote a tribute. And I got a very nice call from John Landau, Bruce Springsteen's manager, who liked very much what I'd written. And I hadn't spoken to John in years and years, but we had a really nice talk. Very fond of John Landau as well. I formed some, I wouldn't call them friendships other than with Steve Popovich, but not everybody that I came to know in the music business was somebody I came to dislike. I have plenty of those, but there are also plenty of examples of people that I admire greatly.
Yeah, sure. Even if you don't get along, you can respect somebody, you know. And
that's true. Yeah. Very true.
Fredric Dannen, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on such short notice too, and making room in your schedule for me. Hitmen, power brokers, and fast money inside the music business. Once again, the podcast is SMA Podcast. You could find there at smapodcast.com. Fredric Dannen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed.
Good night.